Good morning, explorers. Welcome to our online academy here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. My name is Alicia, and I'm very excited to be joining you today for our class all about how animals grow up, or life cycles. Now, I'm not alone here in our studio. I have my friend Jen, who is helping with all of the controls that we have, all of the lovely images. She's zooming me in for us today. Whoa, did you feel that? And then we have Stacy, who's doing all of our questions. So if you have any questions today, I would love to hear from you. So we're going to go ahead and put up our line here. So you can go ahead and text in 562-286-1838. You can always use our email address here if you have questions after our program, or maybe you have a lot of questions if you're joining us from a class today. So we're very excited to be joining you. We are going to be talking today all about how animals grow up and some of the strategies that they use. So there are many different types of animals. And before we talk about ocean animals and their life cycles, I want us to start by thinking about an animal that you might be a little bit more familiar with that we have here at the aquarium, that I happen to really enjoy peeking at when I get a chance up in our tropical Pacific gallery. So Jen, let's go ahead and show this cute, adorable little face of the animal that I would love to talk about today first. And by the way, if you have any observations, so things that you find interesting, comments, maybe you're also a frog fan just like me, you can message us in. Maybe you have a favorite type of frog. Yeah? You have a favorite one? This one's pretty cute. I know. This is how I looked this morning as well. Pretty much my expression when I woke up. So this is a White's tree frog. I like to call a smiley frog here. So when we're looking and investigating an animal, you know, it's important to kind of think about what stage in their life is this animal. Well, the animal that we're looking at right now, this is an adult. But I want us to kind of think about what would this animal look like as a baby? How did it start life? Do all animals start life the same way? Now, depending on where an animal lives can really influence or change how it grows up or how it starts life. And the parents that set that whole baby's life in motion can have a few different ways to make sure that that baby has a good life. So our frog friend here, let's go ahead and look at what we call a life cycle. So from when they're first these tiny little eggs. So not all animals start life as eggs, but as we'll see, there are animals on land and in the ocean that do start as eggs. This is a strategy that is used by many different kinds of animals, not just this group of animals, which we call amphibians. And so here, these are each individual eggs. These are fertilized eggs. So a male and a female, a boy and a girl frog, got together. They fertilized these eggs. So the female produced these eggs. They were fertilized by the male. And now they have all the ingredients that they need to grow a baby inside each of these eggs. There's a little embryo inside that we're going to be growing. So there's all of these ingredients. Now, some frogs can lay their eggs most frogs, I should say, lay their eggs around places that is a little bit damp. Some of them have to be really close to water. Our little friends here, the dart frogs, they live in the rainforest. They actually can lay their eggs in little kind of puddles that are made by plants called bromeliads that are way up in the rainforest, and they create these little pools, and they're perfect for frogs to lay their eggs. The eggs need to be nice and damp, and as they're developing, they'll actually start in those tiny little pools. Same thing with our little animals here. They're going to have to go into those pools. Miss Rodriguez class, hi, welcome, good morning. Does this frog go through metamorphosis? What a wonderful science word. Yes, this animal is going to be changing. So in order to survive in its habitat, it has to change its form. It's going to be changing how it survives in its habitat. So again, where an animal lives is really going to change how even its body, its adaptations change through its life cycle. So we have those fertilized eggs. Those little embryos are growing inside. They have kind of like a packed lunch in there, which is pretty cool. So a lot of animals have nutrients inside. So as they are growing, they have the energy they need to grow. And then they come out as these little tadpoles. Miss Jen, maybe we can take down our lower thirds here so we can read this together. So we start with our embryo, and then they go through this really amazing change. You can even see that with our dart frog, the back end of it, this tail, is not just a tail. Do you see how it kind of looks like a leaf? Isn't that cool? This is another way for this tiny little animal to blend in just a little bit. They look like little Muppets to me. They don't look real. They're just so cute. So they have the ability to swim, but they're starting to change a little bit to a tadpole, so just having a tail to swim around in that water environment, to having little legs. At the same time, they're slowly changing. They're going through that metamorphosis so that they're changing so that they have this tail is slowly going to start disappearing. They're going to go from having gills, which many animals that live in water have to take oxygen from the water that's inside their body, to having lungs. And that is a huge change. That's really amazing. So then this animal is going to be breathing air as it starts to be an adult. And it depends on the type of frog. Sometimes this happens very, very quickly, this whole process, and sometimes it takes a little time. And eventually this animal is going to change color. It's not going to have a tail anymore. It's going to be able to breathe air. By the way, because it's an amphibian, it can also take in oxygen from the air. Everyone take a deep breath. We get that oxygen from our lungs, right? We're breathing inside. Our lungs are taking in that oxygen. They can also do that through their skin, which is so cool. So this is an entire process here. Now, this is just one way that they go ahead and do this, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at some other examples of animals that have maybe different habitats and how that would influence their life cycle. So this animal then is an adult, and this adult, as soon as it's old enough, can start that cycle again. All right, so let's go ahead and visit some of our ocean friends and look at another animal that goes through a huge change in its life cycle. We're going to go and meet our friends, the jellies. Have you heard of a jelly before? Yeah, maybe you call it a jellyfish or a sea jelly. I'm going to call it a sea jelly today because they're part of a group of animals that have no bones in their bodies. And you can call them a jellyfish as a nickname, as long as you remember that because they don't have any bones, they're not really fish. Oh, aren't they beautiful? So we are now looking at an adult. So remember, we were talking about that entire cycle from when an animal is first hatched or born, all the way until when they're old enough to have babies and then eventually die. It's an entire cycle. So this is that adult phase in a jelly's life. This is when we kind of think about a jelly, this is what we think about, right? What do you notice on this jelly? I wonder. Well, I notice that it has this main part to its body called a bell. Can you make a bell with me? There you go. We have this main part here, and you can kind of see them swimming around. So they have some special features on their bodies to help them survive in their ocean home. That's really important to kind of remember. So all of the features that we're looking at here have a way to help them in their ocean home. That bell has a muscle around it that opens and closes and opens and closes to help them move. They also have these stinging tentacles that drift down. So when you make your bell, you have to go ahead and add your tentacles. You ready? Now you've made it into a fancy jelly. Perfect. So if you look too, you have the stringy tentacles, and you kind of have these floofy ones, right? These floofy ones are called oral arms. And together, they can help protect and sting anything that comes in contact, basically. And because they're drifting, they're really, they're swimming around in this ocean home. By the way, this is a webcam. Thanks, Jen. This is happening right here at the aquarium. So we have some nice lighting in the exhibit. If you haven't visited before, we changed the lighting, and now we can really see some color differences, which is beautiful. These are Pacific sea nettles, and you would want to give them a hug. They do have a pretty powerful sting, and so they sting their prey, and then they bring it towards the center of their bodies, so that they can slowly digest it using those kind of those fluffier tentacles, those oral arms. And on the main part of their body, that bell, they have 4 stomachs. Here's a great example. 1, 2, 3, 4. They're kind of like these little horseshoes where they can start to digest that food. Now, I just want you to picture that as an adult. Those are some of those adaptations, because I'm going to take you on a journey to show you some of the crazy strategies that jellies have to survive, because they look very different in their life cycle. Now, I want you to start by finding the adult jelly in this life cycle. Which one do you think is the adult? Can you find the one that has the bell and the tentacles? Did you find it? Good job. Right here. Excellent. So here's that bell. Here are the tentacles. You have the oral arms, and then this type of jelly called a moon jelly has very small stinging tentacles, but they're right here. So the moon jelly is pretty amazing. So here's the adult phase. This is when they're old enough to create eggs and all the parts they need to fertilize their eggs. So we actually do have male and female jellies, and when they're old enough, when they're at this stage, they can release what we call their gametes to fertilize. There we go. And what's really amazing is that the females actually keep their eggs inside underneath for a little bit to help give them a chance to grow. Not all jellies do that. So they hold on to those eggs, and the question is, do jellies come from eggs? Yeah, they do. They have these fertilized eggs that you can kind of see right here. So they look a little bit different than if you were to think about like a chicken egg. So they have this little fertilized eggs that drift around, and then as we move on, we can see that they change their shape. We'll go back to that, maybe the bigger view here. There we go. And then they eventually drift. Now, they have thousands and thousands of these little tiny fertilized eggs that some of them, if they find somewhere perfect to attach to, they actually stick on to maybe the bottom of the ocean, or on this page they have like a nice little rock. Here at the aquarium we grow jellies. I know, isn't that cool? We call it cultivating. We cultivate jellies, and we give them a nice place where they feel comfortable to stick on and start to grow. Oh my. Now this is where it kind of gets interesting. Does this look like the adult? Not really, but they're very tiny. They wouldn't do so well floating around. So in order to give them a head start on growing up a little bit bigger, they start to look almost to me like their cousins. Have you heard of a sea anemone before? Sea anemone, corals, and jellies are all cousins. They have stinging cells, but they're kind of in different shapes. So one has that bell and swims up. An anemone swims like this. To me, this reminds me, oh yeah, they're related to anemones. Here's an anemone. Look kind of similar. Thank you, Miss Jen. So here's their cousin. It's almost like they've stayed in that one form their entire life, which is pretty cool. And that helps them because, and they're much bigger, by the way. You can hold it in your hand, whereas we were talking about very, very tiny. And they have a little sticky foot called a pedal foot underneath. That's kind of what the jelly's doing in their life cycle. They have this sticky area to allow them to attach, drift along, and then all of a sudden they start to form these little individual pieces that eventually turn into jellies. They look like little cups. There we go. And they stack on top of each other. And as soon as the one at the end is ready, so here you go, it starts to look from the anemone phase all the way across to eventually having this tiny little area here that pops off into what we call an ephira. Kind of a fun word to say. So it pops, and then, oh, thank you, Miss Jen. It eventually develops into something that can drift and float into the water. And then it starts to what we call pulse that we were seeing before. And it has to have this shape because this shape is allowing it to survive as an ocean drifter, as it drifts around in the ocean. So this is very different than that initial shape when it was first growing, as we saw attached to the side. Some questions have come in, so I'll take a pause as you're looking at the life cycle here. Miss Rodriguez's class asks, how do jellies breathe? That's an excellent question. Like many of our invertebrate friends out there, they have to have some way to take oxygen from the water. So we have lungs to take oxygen from the air around us. And there are some animals that have gills, like fish or snails, that allow them to take it. Jellies are kind of more simple in their body. They actually can take those tiny little oxygen bubbles and it diffuses or moves through their tissues. So they just kind of absorb the little bubbles of oxygen right through their bodies. They don't have anything as complex as a gill, which is amazing. So here at the aquarium, we kind of joke that they're so simple, they're complicated. They're very, very different than us. And that's why I'm so fascinated by jellies. So we just have to make sure that we monitor the flow of water and that the water has a chance to mix with the air a little bit so that those tiny little bubbles get trapped in the water and are available. We call that dissolved oxygen. That's available for the jellies to breathe, which is pretty amazing. Miss Abe's class asks, what does the diet consist of? Oh, that's a wonderful question. So when they're adults like this, anything that they can sting and move to their stomachs is fair game. Most of that, though, would include things like plankton. Jellies actually also consider plankton. Plankton is a big term for a drifting organism. So in our ocean, we have a lot of very tiny things that drift. And those tiny things could be tiny their whole life. Or they could be tiny, just like the jellies, for just a little bit of their life. They have their own life cycles. But jellies take advantage of their small size. They could also be algae, drifting algae or plants. So call that phytoplankton. So it can be an animal or it can be plant-like or algae that's drifting around. Plankton consists of most of what jellies eat. There are some jellies, though, that will sting small fish and shrimp that get stuck in their tentacles. This jelly here actually is it can actually eat things like moon jellies. Don't tell the moon jellies. The one that we were just looking at, yeah, it can eat other jellies. Another term for this stage of their life apparently is called the Medusa form from Greek mythology. And so because they eat other jellies, they're called medusivores, kind of like a carnivore. More science terms, but I'm so glad you asked because jellies are just so interesting. Miss A's class also asked, how big do jellies get? Oh, the lion's mane jelly has been recorded at just over 100 feet long. Isn't that amazing? And it had an almost 12-foot bell. 12 feet. Maybe if you're home, your parents can help you measure out 12 feet, and that was from one side of the bell to another. Not just how long it is, but how wide the bell is. That is amazing. And those jellies are sometimes found in colder regions up in Alaska, which I think is pretty cool. All right, some other questions coming in here. Miss Stranford's class, what animal has the most dramatic change in its life cycle? Oh, that's an excellent question. I might have to think about that. Let's go back to our jellies because I think they're a great example here. So the jelly eventually starts to fill out from this little fire stage. I think Miss Jen will put up our video here that shows, maybe you can help me identify some of those different pieces of their life cycle. So here's a photograph showing us some of the strobila, which we see here. And in this part of their life too, they still have these stinging cells, so they can still capture plankton from the water, which is pretty cool. Although they do have, just like many animals, they do start off life with enough kind of like of a packed lunch to get them going. And that takes a lot of energy from the adults. That's why healthy adults, when they have their babies, have healthier babies. So if those adults are able to find food and find a good partner to have babies, then they often have better babies, or what we call offspring. Miss Barraza's class asked, do jellies sleep, and how long do jellies live? Oh, I love those questions. There was actually a study that showed that jellies do have to rest. They don't sleep like us because they don't have brains. Isn't that interesting? They have this really complicated life cycle. Like I said, so simple they're complicated, but they only rest their bodies. They don't fully shut down and have what we call our REM cycle. So that's an excellent question. How long do jellies live? Oh, here's the video I was thinking about. Thank you, Miss Jen. Yeah, this is really amazing. This is from our exhibit here. Remember I said we grow jellies or cultivate jellies? This is an example of our jellies growing. And you might be able to even see, here's the strobila. You might even see an individual, almost a phyra. And they're actively catching plankton, by the way. So in these different life cycles, they can still capture. Oh, there we go. Do you see it swim by? That's one that had popped off. It's like, I'm determined to be a jelly. So they're drifting around. They even change their colors. So it's kind of difficult to measure how long it lives because you can have these stacks here live for many years. But if you're counting the individual that pops off, then the moon jelly lives anywhere from 6 months to maybe a year. Usually it's around a summer season. Here at the aquarium, they live around a year after they've kind of popped off and become that aphyra to the adult stage. And that's because we can keep the conditions or the home here for the animals really gentle. There's not a lot of wave action. They like the nice cold temperature. At the end of their life cycle, they really start to deteriorate. They don't have a lot that holds them together. They're pretty gelatinous, and they've had a whole life of trying to move through those ocean currents, which can be kind of hard on them. So they generally live kind of that summer season. And that last stage, again, is having those babies, so that starts that whole cycle again. Miss Marino's class asked, how do they protect themselves? What an excellent question. So, what we do see, except for in this stage right here, when they're very, very tiny, which they're very vulnerable because they're tiny, each of these other stages, they still have kind of those stinging cells, so they're able to protect themselves. A lot of times, too, they use, for example, the moon jellies are pretty opaque, meaning that they have this real light color, and they're hard to see. So you have to kind of, or the crystal jelly, Miss Jen is telling me. So sometimes they can use camouflage. They can be clear to help them blend in. Now, if you're a big jelly, you might not worry about it as much. If you're smaller, maybe you don't have as strong of stinging cells like the moon jelly. That's the jelly that we can touch here at the aquarium. Then you might have another tactic of just kind of blending in just a little bit. So moon jellies have, again, these smaller tentacles. They don't need those long ones because their prey, the food that they eat, is a little bit smaller. And then Raphael asked, do they have a heart? That's an excellent question. They do not have a heart. The they have a very simple system. You know, that's a great question because our heart helps us move the blood around our body, and that blood is important to move through our body because it carries nutrients and oxygen, right? So when we breathe in, we have oxygen going into our lungs, and that oxygen is then in our blood and transferred through our blood to the rest of our body. So the little oxygen bubbles that are transferred into the jelly, because it can basically be absorbed through the main part of the jelly, they don't really need a heart to do that. They have kind of what we call an open circulation system. So inside, their tissues are a little goopy, but they don't need to move it through as much space as like our body. And then how many types of jellies out there? Oh, that's a wonderful question as well, explorers. There are more than 2,000 that scientists have so far identified, but that does not mean that there are only 2,000. I hope you're inspired by the jellies here to to maybe learn more about the oceans, maybe learn a little bit more about some of these very interesting and very different animals. Maybe you will be the one to identify a new ocean animal. But by far, we keep finding new critters in the ocean. So don't think that they're all found. Maybe you could be the explorer that finds them. Miss Nicolosi's class asked, how do jellies see? Oh, when thinking about how do animals survive in their habitat, how do they gather information about the world around us? We can gather information around the world around us because we have our senses, right? We have our 5 senses. But not all animals use their senses the same way or have the same senses. Jellies have a way to sense light, but they don't have a way to see pictures or complex images like we do. So around their body, they have little light sensors. And this is actually the same for animals like sea stars and some other invertebrates. So if you were to close your eyes and cover up your eyes, you can kind of see when it's light or dark, but you're not seeing any pictures. So they have what we call photoreceptors, but they're really just to make sure that the jelly knows where the surface of the ocean is and where it's down deeper. Now they can't swim very far, and really because they don't have a brain, they're not making any complicated decisions. They're just kind of reacting. So they have little sets of nerves to help them react, but they don't really have anything complex. So they're just kind of doing a basic reaction to their environment. They even have a little sensor in their body. Think of it like a little circle that has hairs all the way around it in a little bubble. And when they turn, that bubble will always go up. So the bubble goes up and tickles the hairs, and the jelly knows that it's turned on its side. Or if it flips this way, that bubble goes towards the top and tickles the hair up there, and they go, oh, I'm on this side now. And if they're in the middle, it goes up and it tickles the top. So they know kind of where they are in their environment based on that extra sense. So they're just another way for them to kind of feel around. So Isaac from Woodcrest Elementary says, how do you swim with them without getting stung? That's a good question. So I have been stung on accident out there in the ocean, and a lot of times it's because I don't see them. Remember we talked about how one of their adaptations is being hard to see? Yeah, I've been snorkeling or scuba diving, and if I'm not wearing a wetsuit, which is recommended for a lot of divers, if I'm just out there and I'm not wearing a wetsuit, then I can potentially get stung by them. But a lot of scuba divers are protected because they have that nice covering over them. So there are some jellies, like the moon jellies, that don't have a really powerful sting. It doesn't go through our layers of skin, so you can pet them. There are some other jellies that have, over time, evolved to have very few stinging cells, so they just don't need them. This jelly here, this lagoon jelly, instead of stinging a lot of its food, it does something kind of interesting. It has a partnership, a symbiotic partnership. It grows its food inside of it. What? I know. It has a partner, algae, that grows inside its body, it uses sunlight, and the algae is like, hey, can I stay at your place and I will make you food every day? And the jelly is like, sure, that's a great plan. So as long as the algae has food, it can give extra sugar that it makes from photosynthesis, that process of taking sunlight and converting it over to sugar, and gives it to the jelly, and then the jelly protects it. So it does have a few stinging cells, but different jellies have either longer stinging cells or shorter depending on their lifestyle. So again, when we think about an animal surviving, it can have different adaptations even in how it grows up. So some animals have lots and lots of babies, and they hope that maybe just one of them survives. Other animals, like let's say a seal, they will have maybe one baby at a time, and mama will protect that baby for a long period of time. So there are lots of different ways to survive, and their habitat and how much care maybe an adult puts into it maybe even how long that animal lives can all depend on that life cycle. So we only just talked about 2 animals. Oh my goodness, I wanted to talk about all kinds of ocean things, but we had so many wonderful questions come in, and I think we answered most of them. Miss Tuscany's class asked, why do jellies have stingers? Oh, so that was for protection and to also grab their food. And then do they change colors? They do change colors a little bit sometimes in that life cycle, but as adults, I'm not too familiar with them changing colors once they have those pigments. Thank you, everybody. We're a little bit over our time. I'm going to ask a big favor for all of our teachers here. We're going to go ahead and put that number up. We're trying to get an estimate of how many viewers we have, and we know, teachers, that it's probably not just you have a classroom with students, so if you wouldn't mind texting us really quick with how many students are watching with you, that really helps us understand how many viewers we have and how many programs we should be offering from the Aquarium of the Pacific. So our number again is 562-286-1838. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. We have another program at 10 a.m. this morning looking at our Earth. I hope that you're able to join us, and I think we have a special guest coming at 10. So, all right, everyone, take care.